It was a chilly autumn afternoon when I set off for my weekend camping trip in the heart of England's Lake District. The year was 2023, and I had just turned 28. I'd been looking forward to this break for weeks. Life had been hectic, work had been demanding, and I just needed some solitude to clear my head. I had spent months searching for the perfect campsite, away from the usual tourist spots, somewhere isolated where I could connect with nature. I arrived at a secluded site on the outskirts of a small village, surrounded by towering pine trees and rolling hills. The trail leading to the campsite was narrow and barely marked, winding through the dense forest. I was alone, with no other campers in sight. The silence was almost unsettling at first, but it was the kind of peace I craved. I unloaded my gear from the car, my trusty old tent, sleeping bag, stove, and a couple of cans of beans for food. The weather was overcast but calm, and I could tell it would be cold as the evening approached. After setting up camp, I took a walk around the area, exploring the woods. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, the fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots. The air had a crispness to it, and the scent of pine needles filled my nostrils. Despite the beauty, there was something off. The deeper I ventured, the more I felt like I was being watched. I chalked it up to the eeriness of the woods and pushed the thought aside, focusing on the tranquility of the place. As I returned to my campsite, I began to prepare dinner. The simple act of boiling water for some instant noodles calmed my nerves, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, the first real stars of the night began to appear. The crackling of the fire added to the peaceful atmosphere, and I felt a sense of contentment. Everything seemed perfect, too perfect, maybe, but then the quiet was broken. A soft rustling came from the trees behind my camp. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the noise didn't stop. It wasn't the natural rustle of an animal scurrying through the leaves. It was too deliberate. A branch snapped, and I froze, my hand instinctively going for the small pocket knife in my jacket pocket. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my heart raced. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. I stood still, waiting, listening. The rustling continued, growing closer, and then nothing. Complete silence. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease. "It's just the wind," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. Still, I resumed my dinner, occasionally glancing around the camp, half expecting someone to appear from the shadows. But there was no one, just the distant sounds of the forest. The fire crackled, its orange glow dancing in the otherwise dark surroundings. I ate quickly, eager to finish before the cold set in fully. The temperature had already dropped considerably, and the dampness in the air made the chill even worse. I climbed into my tent after cleaning up, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. The rustling outside was still fresh in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but it didn't feel like just wind. It felt like something was out there, waiting. I turned over in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open, staring at the faint outlines of my gear through the dark. The hours dragged on, and every noise seemed to pull me deeper into a sense of dread. I had almost convinced myself that I was being paranoid when I heard it again, this time closer than before. A slow, deliberate step. I couldn't pinpoint the direction, but it was unmistakable. My heart started to pound, and I lay there, frozen, barely daring to breathe. The sound of someone or something was now unmistakable, stepping through the underbrush outside my tent. My hand gripped the knife tightly, my knuckles white, but I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced through every possible scenario, and none of them seemed good. The steps stopped just outside the tent. My pulse hammered in my ears as I held my breath, straining to hear. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there, The minutes felt like hours. My mind kept racing, but my body was paralyzed with fear. I could hear my own heartbeat thumping loudly in the silence, drowning out the rest of the world. I didn't dare move a muscle, not even to adjust my grip on the knife. The sounds from outside were muffled, but I could tell whoever or whatever was there wasn't leaving. The weight of their presence was suffocating. I stayed that way for what felt like an eternity. The wind had picked up again, but the noises outside were still there, lingering, just on the other side of the tent. I couldn't help myself anymore. I had to know what it was. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper of the tent. My hands were clammy, shaking with fear, but I forced myself to move. The sound of the zipper seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. As the flap of the tent parted just slightly, I pushed it open a little more, sticking my head out into the cold night air. The fire was little more than a few glowing embers now, casting long shadows against the trees. The night felt unusually still, the wind no longer howling through the branches. And then I saw it. There, standing near the edge of my campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight, was a figure. A person, tall and thin, dressed in dark, weathered clothes. They stood motionless, facing away from me, but I could sense their presence, feel their eyes on me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see their face, but I could make out the shape of them, their posture, the way they seemed to blend into the darkness. I couldn't tell how long I had been staring, but eventually, the figure moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to walk away from the camp. No quick movements, no rush, just a slow, methodical retreat into the forest. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. The moment I saw it start to walk away, I scrambled out of the tent and grabbed my flashlight. My heart was still pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I was terrified, but I had to know who or what was out there. I stepped cautiously through the campsite, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I didn't dare call out, didn't dare make a sound. The figure was moving farther now, but not fast, almost like it was waiting for me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, torn between the overwhelming fear of what I might find and the deep, gnawing curiosity that urged me forward. I decided to follow. The figure moved farther into the woods, and I kept my distance, trying to stay hidden behind the trees. The underbrush crunched beneath my boots as I carefully navigated through the forest. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of the figure up ahead, their shape barely visible in the low light. They didn't seem to be in any hurry, as if they knew I was following but didn't mind. It wasn't until we reached a clearing that I realized how far I had followed. The figure stopped in the center of the clearing, facing away from me. My breath was ragged, and I was covered in a cold sweat, but I had to know who this person was. I took one step forward, then another, and then I saw it. The figure turned around slowly, and in that moment, I froze. The face that stared back at me was gaunt, pale, and hollow-eyed. It was a face I didn't recognize, but somehow it felt familiar, disturbingly familiar. And then it smiled. The smile was not comforting. It wasn't friendly. It was a twisted, unsettling expression that sent a chill down my spine. I took another step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me, smiling that terrible smile. It was almost as if it was daring me to approach. I turned around quickly, my body acting on instinct. I ran back toward my camp as fast as I could, my feet stumbling over rocks and twigs. My breath was ragged, my mind unable to process what I had just seen. All I could think of was getting back to the safety of my tent, locking myself in, and never leaving. But even as I ran, I could still feel that smile, that gaze, haunting me from the darkness. When I finally reached my camp, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things, shoved them into my bag, and started to pack up. I couldn't stay there anymore. I didn't care how late it was or how cold it had become. I wasn't going to risk staying another minute in the woods. I was terrified, utterly terrified, and I knew I couldn't spend another night there. It took me almost an hour to pack everything up, my hands shaking uncontrollably the entire time. I had never been more scared in my life. But eventually, I got everything into my car and slammed the door shut. Without a second thought, I started the engine and drove away, not looking back once. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a small inn to stay the night. The relief I felt when I saw the warm lights of the inn was overwhelming. I checked into a room, locked the door, and sat on the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. I never did find out who or what the figure in the woods was, but one thing was certain. I would never go camping alone again, not in that part of England, and not ever again. The memory of that face and that smile would stay with me for the rest of my life. I learned that some parts of the world are better left unexplored. And as I finally fell asleep that night, exhausted but safe, I could only hope that whatever it was out there would never come for me again. I'd been planning this trip for months, the sort of thing I'd done before. A quiet escape from the daily grind. It had been a while since I'd taken a break from the city. Too long, really. This time, though, I was going solo. I had been craving some solitude and, truth be told, the idea of being away from people for a few days felt like exactly what I needed. I decided to head up to a remote spot in the mountains just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm 32, and I'm used to hiking and camping alone, but this would be different, a bit more isolated. The place I picked, White Bear Canyon, wasn't a spot most people knew about. My friend had told me about it, but when I asked around, no one else seemed to know it. Perfect. No tourists, no rangers, just me and the wilderness. The drive there was beautiful, the sort of scenic route where every corner revealed something new. A hidden stream, towering cliffs, the smell of pines and the crispness of the mountain air. I left my phone in the car when I parked, as I always did on trips like this. It didn't make sense to have it with me out here. I set up camp in a small, clear area near the edge of a ridge, just off the trail. There was a fire ring already in place, an old one, but it looked usable enough. The sun was starting to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I quickly unpacked my gear, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, and some food. Nothing fancy. I knew the drill. The mountain air was growing cooler, and the fire crackled as I got it going. I settled down for the evening, roasting some sausages over the flames and enjoying the solitude. I didn't feel scared, but I was aware of the silence. It was different than the sort of silence you get in a city or even in a quiet town. Out here, there's an unsettling quality to the quiet. It's a heavy silence filled with the sounds of nature that are easy to ignore when you're not paying attention. The wind rustling the leaves, the occasional chirp of a distant bird, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But otherwise, it was silent. As the night deepened, I lay in my tent listening to the crackling fire outside. The wind had picked up, making the trees sway in a way that reminded me of how fragile everything really was. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. The fire had long since burned down, and with it, the usual sounds of the wilderness took over. I heard a branch snap in the distance. That was normal. It was probably just a deer or something else making its way through the woods. But then I heard another snap closer this time. My heart skipped a beat. I turned over in my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. A few minutes later, I heard something else. A soft, crunching noise coming from just beyond the fire ring. It was as though someone, or something, was walking in the darkness, stepping carefully over the forest floor. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too cautious. Whoever it was, they were trying to be quiet. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sound, but the forest had gone completely still again. I waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Slowly, I let the tension ease from my body and rolled back over. It was probably just some camper or a hiker passing through the area. No big deal. But the moment I began to relax, the noise came again. Closer this time. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, the beam cutting through the darkness. But when I swept it around the campsite, I saw nothing. Not a single thing moving. I shone it over the trail that led away from the fire pit, but it was empty, the path snaking off into the trees. Still, that feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I lay back down, my mind racing. There had to be someone out there. Maybe another camper who didn't have a fire. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Not in the way that made sense. I managed to fall asleep eventually, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. I kept waking up, hearing the occasional snap of a twig, the distant rush of wind through the pines. Each time, I would hold my breath, hoping it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. At first light, I was awake and on edge. The air was still cool, the morning mist hanging low among the trees. I packed up my tent and gear quickly, wanting to be ready in case I needed to leave. But part of me, some primal part of me, was telling me to stay. I could make it through one more night, surely. And maybe, just maybe, I was overthinking it. I decided to go for a hike. The morning light bathed the canyon in a soft, golden glow, and the sounds of birds and the wind calmed my nerves a bit. The forest felt more normal during the day, full of life and movement. I didn't hear anything strange, nothing that made me uneasy. But as I made my way up a trail toward a higher ridge, I saw something that made my stomach turn. I couldn't describe it properly at first, the thing I saw. It wasn't an animal and it wasn't a person. It was just wrong. A pile of discarded things, like someone had been living there but had left in a hurry. It was too clean for it to be natural. I found old clothes, torn fabric that looked like it had been ripped from something, a tarp half buried under some pine needles. No campfire, no tools, nothing that looked like it belonged in the wild. It felt out of place in a way I couldn't explain. I stepped closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The pile was strange, as though someone had carefully hidden it. And then, as I moved even closer, I saw a small wooden box, wedged into the dirt. I didn't touch it. The gut feeling inside me told me not to. I wasn't about to open something that had been left there like that. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. Something wasn't right about this. I had no proof of anything, no evidence, but the feeling that had been gnawing at me since the night before was back. There was someone else out here, someone who didn't want to be found. I spent the rest of the day trying to ignore the unease creeping back into my bones. The hike was nice, the air cool, the trees tall and imposing, but there was that box in the woods, that abandoned spot, and it lingered in my mind. I didn't want to think about it too much, but the thought of being watched or followed kept me alert. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low again, casting long shadows on the ground. I decided to start a fire and settle in for the night, but as I prepared the kindling, something else hit me. An odd sensation, like someone was standing just behind me, watching. I spun around, but again, there was nothing. I brushed it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe the stress was getting to me. I had no reason to be afraid, but still the shadows seemed darker, the wind colder. Something in my gut told me that I wasn't alone out here. That night, I stayed awake. I didn't even bother to try sleeping. I kept my eyes on the trail, the trees, the dark spaces between the trunks. Hours passed and still nothing happened, but the tension kept building. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. the footsteps, careful and slow, coming closer. I froze, listening intently. This time, they were unmistakable. Someone was out there. They were just beyond my camp, moving slowly, trying to stay hidden. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sound, but once again, I saw nothing. My pulse quickened, but I refused to let fear take over. I had to stay calm. The noise stopped, and then there was nothing. The silence returned, thick and heavy. I stayed awake the rest of the night, not daring to close my eyes. At first light, I packed up my things quickly, no longer caring about being quiet. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to leave. I didn't waste any time heading back down the trail to my car. I was done. As I reached my car, I felt the tension finally leave my body. There was no one behind me. No one had followed me. But that feeling, that primal, unshakable feeling, never really went away. There was something I had missed, something I didn't understand. But I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I never went back to White Bear Canyon. And as I drove away, leaving the forest behind me, I felt like I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. Something that might have been waiting for me all along. It was early October, and the forest air had that crisp chill to it, the kind of chill that settles deep into your bones when you're not used to it. I had taken the weekend off to get away from the noise of city life, the pressure of work, and the weight of everything I was dealing with in my personal life. So, when I came across a small, off-the-beaten-path cemetery, the idea of camping there seemed like a strange but oddly appealing idea. No one would be around, and it would be the perfect place to think and clear my head. Or so I thought. The place was tucked into the corner of a small, run-down town in West Virginia, a place I never expected to find myself in. The cemetery had been abandoned for years, from what I could tell. The old iron gate that once secured the grounds was bent and rusted, and the path leading to it was overgrown with wild grass, weeds, and stray trees that had started to take over the area. But there was something about it that intrigued me. Maybe it was the solitude or the challenge of setting up camp in such an eerie place. I drove my beat-up truck down the narrow, unpaved road, which led to the cemetery. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing old gravestones sticking out at odd angles from the ground, their surfaces weathered and eroded by time. I parked by the entrance and sat for a minute, taking it all in. The area felt strangely calm, too calm almost. The distant sound of rustling leaves in the wind made the whole place feel like it was breathing. After grabbing my gear from the truck, I made my way past the broken gate. The air smelled of damp earth, mixed with the faint scent of decay that seemed to linger everywhere in the woods. I set up my tent in a small clearing near the far corner of the cemetery, where the stones were oldest, their markings barely legible. I figured it was far enough away from the main entrance, where I wouldn't feel like I was too close to the crumbling graves. I didn't know why, but something about the place felt off. I kept hearing noises, but nothing I could pinpoint. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling through the trees or knocking against the gravestones. But as the night wore on, I started to wonder if maybe I was just trying to convince myself that it was nothing. The sounds came in waves, sometimes a branch snapping, other times what sounded like footsteps far off in the distance. The night grew darker, and the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. I tried to ignore the unease settling in my chest, telling myself it was just my imagination. But when I lay back in my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My eyes kept darting around the cemetery, trying to make sense of the shadows dancing across the graves. I finally closed my eyes, hoping sleep would come. But then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, reached my ears. My heart raced, and my mind scrambled to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, or perhaps someone else had wandered into the cemetery. I told myself it didn't matter. It was just the wind, the branches, something natural. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I sat up in my tent, my breath shallow, trying to calm myself. The footsteps were closer now. My eyes scanned the edges of the graveyard, but there was nothing. No person, no animal, just the endless rows of gravestones. I debated whether I should get out and investigate, but my instincts told me to stay put. I didn't want to risk finding something that could explain the noise, something I wouldn't be able to forget once I saw it. The noise stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath, and the entire cemetery fell into a kind of eerie silence. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining to catch any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The air felt thick, like it was pressing against me, making it harder to breathe. Suddenly, I heard it again, a soft scrape against the ground, followed by a faint rustling. This time, it was unmistakable. It was coming from behind me, from the direction of the gravestones I had avoided setting up camp near. My mind raced. Was someone walking through the cemetery? A hunter? A wanderer? Or something else? I grabbed my flashlight, flicking it on and shining it toward the noise. For a brief moment, the light illuminated the graves in front of me. Shadows stretched out, playing tricks with my mind. The wind howled, and for a split second, I thought I saw something or someone moving between the graves. I couldn't make out any details, just a dark shape slipping between the stones, almost like it was trying to stay hidden. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. The figure was gone in an instant, leaving me with nothing but the darkness and the sound of my own racing pulse. I thought about calling out, but what if it wasn't just someone passing through? What if it was someone who had no business being here? Someone who was trying to find me? The thought made my blood run cold. I knew I had to leave, but I didn't dare move. I wasn't sure if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Something was watching me, waiting. I had no idea how much time passed, but every creak of the trees, every rustle in the underbrush, made me jump. I couldn't bring myself to leave the tent. As I lay there, too scared to sleep, I started to hear something else. A low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from beneath the ground. At first, I thought it was just an animal digging, but then it grew louder, almost like something or someone was dragging themselves across the dirt. The noise stopped, but the feeling of dread only intensified. I knew I couldn't stay here much longer. My instincts were screaming at me to pack up and leave, but the fear held me in place. Eventually, the morning light began to creep over the horizon. The shadows of the cemetery stretched long across the ground as the first rays of sunlight pierced through the trees. The eerie silence that had consumed the night began to lift, and the world around me slowly started to feel more normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something I hadn't seen, but something that had been too close. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I folded the tent and stuffed it into my bag. The footsteps, the dragging noise, everything still lingered in my mind. When I got back to my truck and drove away from the cemetery, I couldn't help but look over my shoulder one last time. There was nothing behind me, no figure lurking in the graveyard, no one waiting in the shadows, just the wind, the trees, and the old gravestones. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly avoided something I couldn't explain. Something I didn't want to understand. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I didn't have to. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. But I would never go back to that cemetery, and I would never go camping alone in a place like that again. Some places are better left undisturbed, forgotten by time, and I had learned that lesson the hard way. As I drove away, the town faded in my rearview mirror, and I finally felt like I could breathe again. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never forget that night in the graveyard. It had changed something in me. I wasn't sure what I had encountered, but I knew I didn't ever want to find out. My name's Matt. I was 32 when this happened. I was living in Denver back then, working long hours as a freelance web developer. That summer had been brutal for my mental health. Deadlines piling up, client calls dragging past midnight, junk food dinners, and my sleep schedule in shambles. I hadn't taken a break in almost a year, so when I saw a last-minute opening on a backcountry camping permit site for a remote spot in the San Juan Mountains of southwest Colorado, I didn't hesitate. Booked it right away. 5 days, for nights, completely off-grid, just what I needed to reset. The area was in a national forest, not an official campground. No running water, no cell service, no ranger station nearby. You had to park about 6 miles from the nearest paved road, hike another 3 or 4 miles past the trailhead, and then you were on your own. It wasn't technically illegal to camp there, just rarely visited, since it required effort and had 0 facilities. I left on a Tuesday morning in late August 2017. I took my old Subaru Outback, packed my gear the night before. Tent, sleeping bag, freeze-dried meals, bear spray, water filter, solar charger, compass, map, even a cheap emergency radio. I wasn't new to this. I'd done solo camping trips before, though usually in places a little closer to civilization. This was my first time going completely alone, completely off-grid. The drive took almost 7 hours. The last stretch was a dusty Forest Service road barely wide enough for 2 cars. I didn't pass another vehicle for miles. I parked in the tiny pull-off near the marked but mostly overgrown trailhead around 4 p.m. I hiked until a little after 6 p.m. The sun dipped behind the mountain ridges, and I found a flat clearing just above a stream with a decent view of the valley below. It looked perfect, secluded, quiet, peaceful. I pitched my tent, made dinner, and sat with my back against a tree watching the colors change in the sky. The first night was normal, chilly but calm. I slept straight through. I didn't set up a campfire because I was too tired and didn't want to draw attention to smoke in such a dry area. I had a small camping stove for heating water and relied on my headlamp after dark. The second day, I explored a few rocky outcrops and followed the stream uphill. I spotted some deer, some fox tracks, and a hawk circling above a ridge. It felt good to breathe air that didn't smell like car exhaust or leftover pizza. I didn't see or hear another soul. My boots got soaked at one point crossing a deeper part of the stream, but I laid them out in the sun for a few hours and they dried enough to wear by the evening. Again, no problems. The trouble started on day 3. That morning, I woke up to find a rock had been placed just outside my tent zipper. Not a natural formation, not a rock that just rolled down a slope. A smooth river stone, about the size of my palm, laid perfectly on top of a flat leaf. I just stared at it for a few seconds, still groggy. I'd zipped the tent shut the night before, had no food left outside, no reason for any animal to be snooping around. It unsettled me. I scanned the area for footprints. Nothing obvious. The soil was dry and hard-packed. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was part of a game some backpacker left behind. Maybe it fell out of my bag somehow and landed just like that. It didn't make any sense, but I didn't want to admit that someone or something had been close to my tent while I slept. I moved it aside and didn't think about it again for a few hours. That day I did some journaling, took a nap in the afternoon, and hiked up to a ledge overlooking a canyon about an hour before sunset. I brought a peanut butter sandwich and a can of warm beer I'd buried in the stream the day before. I sat on the ledge, legs dangling, soaking it in. It was honestly the most at peace I'd felt in months. But when I got back to my tent, something was off. The zipper wasn't where I'd left it. I always zipped it to the bottom left corner. I I remembered doing it before I left, but now it was on the top right side, about a third of the way down. My heart dropped into my stomach. I stepped closer. The flaps were still sealed, but the line in the dirt where the zipper had pressed into the ground was different. It had definitely been opened and closed. I stood there frozen for a solid minute. Then I unzipped it and looked inside. Everything was there: my sleeping bag, my gear, my pack, my jacket. Nothing missing. Nothing seemed moved, but someone had opened it. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay with the bear spray in my hand and the emergency radio next to my head. I kept the zipper closed tight and placed a small pile of twigs just outside the tent entrance. If someone came near, I'd hear the crackle. At least I hoped I would. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard movement outside. Slow, careful footsteps. I held my breath. Couldn't be sure. It might have been wind, or a deer, or my own mind unraveling. I didn't open the zipper to check. I just lay there, heart hammering, every little sound amplified in the darkness. When I finally fell asleep near dawn, I dreamed I was being watched through the trees. That feeling stuck with me the rest of the day. Day 4, I decided to cut the trip short. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a gut instinct screaming at me that something was wrong. I packed up camp around noon and hiked halfway back to the trailhead. I didn't want to reach my car too early and have to drive in the dark, so I set up a temporary camp a few miles out from the lot, just to rest and leave early the next morning. The new spot was less scenic, close to a bend in the trail with no view, but I didn't care. I wanted out. That evening, I made the mistake of checking my gear again. I realized something subtle had changed. One of the side pockets in my pack was open. Inside, the zipper had been fully undone and re-zipped the wrong way. Again, something I never do. I always zip from left to right. Inside the pocket, my water filter and my backup compass. Both were there, but the compass had been turned upside down and tucked into a mesh sleeve. The filter was damp, as if someone had tested it. I felt cold all over, not from the air, but from the realization that someone had been inside my pack. Someone had touched my things. Someone had watched me go off, then gone through my stuff while I was away. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even try. I sat with my back against a tree a few yards from my tent and waited. The forest was so quiet it buzzed in my ears. I kept thinking I saw movement at the edge of the trees, quick flashes between trunks. But every time I stood up to check, nothing. Around 3 a.m., I finally heard it. Twigs snapping. Deliberate, slow steps. Not random crunches, not wind. Someone was walking nearby. Then silence. Then a whisper of movement again. I switched off my headlamp and crouched behind a tree. My heart thudded so loud I felt it in my neck. The steps got closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything, but I felt eyes on me. That horrible, unmistakable pressure of being watched. Then nothing. After several minutes, I crept back to my gear, stuffed everything into my pack as fast as I could, and started hiking. I didn't wait for sunrise. I didn't bother packing the tent. I left it behind. I just wanted out. The trail back to the car was a blur. I didn't run exactly, but I didn't stop either. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. Every bend in the path felt like a trap. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But no one did. When I reached the car just after 7 a.m., the first thing I noticed was that the driver's side door handle was wet, like it had been touched recently. There had been no rain or dew. I checked the lock, still sealed, nothing missing from inside. But it chilled me. I got in, locked the doors, and drove for nearly 2 hours before I stopped. Only when I reached a gas station in a small town called Eerie did I finally let myself breathe again. I never reported it. What would I say? Someone left a rock outside my tent and moved my compass? There were no signs of assault, no stolen items, nothing technically illegal. Just signs, warnings, presence, pattern. I've never been camping alone since. And sometimes, I still wake up thinking I hear twigs snapping just outside my window. I was 31 that year, living in Arkansas, working as a forklift operator for a warehouse near Fayetteville. I'd just come off a long stretch of 6-day weeks. Most of my time was eaten up by work and sleep. I needed something to feel like I had some control over my time again. So I took a Friday off and made a plan to head out Thursday evening for a solo camping trip in the Ozarks, northwest of a place called Ork. I picked out a spot from a map a coworker mentioned once. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing off a long-forgotten Forest Service road. I figured the fewer people around, the better. I wasn't looking for company. I wanted quiet, nature, and time alone. I packed light but enough. My tent, a decent sleeping bag, a tarp, a hatchet, a flashlight, a folding knife, 2 lighters, and enough food for 3 days. I also had a basic first aid kit and an old GPS unit. The drive out took about 2.5 hours through winding roads and soft rain that had started mid-afternoon. By the time I left the paved highway for the dirt path, the rain had thickened. It wasn't a downpour, just steady and heavy enough to soak you through if you stood out in it long. The Forest Service road I'd turned onto had seen better days. Potholes filled with muddy water, brush closing in from both sides, and the occasional rock slide that looked like it had been there for years without anyone clearing it. I had an older 4Runner, the kind that still had some steel under it, so I trusted it to get me through. Took another 45 minutes crawling through that mess before I found the clearing. It was maybe 40 feet wide and shaped like an oval, surrounded by tall trees on every side. You couldn't see the sky unless you looked straight up. A good place to be alone, a bad place to get in trouble. I set up quickly. The rain wasn't letting up, and the light was dying behind the clouds fast. I got the tent up, laid the tarp beneath it, and made sure everything inside was dry. My backpack stayed under the small awning of the tent. I knew from past trips to keep the food sealed and high, so I hung the food sack on a tree about 20 yards from camp. I didn't want raccoons sniffing around. I hadn't seen a soul since turning off the highway. No other vehicles.
No hikers.
Nothing but birds and wet trees. The night came fast, and the rain got heavier. I sat in the tent listening to it for a while, watching the inside of the nylon darken as clouds thickened. The sound was calming at first, like white noise, but it didn't stay that way. Around 9 or so, I thought I heard something under the sound of rain. Not loud, just movement, a branch cracking, leaves shifting, something light, not like a deer, more like a person walking slow. I stopped breathing for a second to listen. The rain wasn't loud enough to drown everything out, and sure enough, I heard it again. Something moving past the tent, maybe 15 or 20 feet out. Could have been an animal, I told myself. Maybe a fox or a feral hog, but it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too spaced out. Even through the rain, I could feel the rhythm of footsteps. I reached for the hatchet. It was just inside the tent flap. I stayed still, not breathing, just holding the handle tight and waiting. I didn't want to unzip the tent. I wasn't even sure I wanted to know. The footsteps stopped. I waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The rain kept falling, steady and hard, but nothing else moved. Eventually, I talked myself down. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe the wind had dropped something from a tree. I made sure everything was zipped and latched, turned off the flashlight, and tried to sleep. It was a rough night. Every time I started to drift off, a gust of wind or heavier rain would snap me back. My mind wouldn't stop turning. What if someone had followed me up here? What if they'd parked somewhere and hiked in? What if they were out there watching the tent? I'd left no trace on the road in, but the tracks behind my SUV would have been easy to follow if someone came in after me. By 3 a.m., I was still wide awake. The inside of the tent was humid and cold at the same time, and my sleeping bag was starting to feel clammy. I hadn't heard any more footsteps, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it again, closer this time, a sharp, dry snap of a stick, not blown by wind, stepped on. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. This time, I knew it wasn't just in my head. The sound came from behind the tent, opposite the direction I'd hung the food. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Then I slowly reached down and unzipped the side pocket of my bag, pulling out the flashlight without making much noise. I flipped it on and clicked it to red mode, less visible from a distance. I unzipped the front of the tent an inch, just enough to peek out. My breath fogged the small gap. I scanned the tree line. Nothing but shadow and branches dripping rain. But there was something wrong. There were no animal sounds anymore. The night bugs, frogs, the far-off owl I'd heard earlier, all of it had stopped. That silence hit harder than anything else. Felt intentional, like the forest was warning me. I slid back inside, zipped the flap, and waited. The rain kept falling, heavier now. The roof of the tent sagged in spots where water was pooling. I checked my watch, 4:12 a.m. That's when I saw it. A small silhouette moving past the tent on the left side. Close, no more than 6 feet away. I couldn't make out details, but it wasn't an animal. It was upright, human-shaped. It moved slow, almost carefully, like it was trying not to be noticed. I didn't breathe. I didn't even blink. My fingers tightened around the hatchet, and I held the flashlight, ready to swing it on. But I didn't move. If they didn't know I was awake, I wanted to keep it that way. The shape paused near the front of the tent, just outside the awning. And then it kept walking, slow, deliberate steps fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until full daylight before I moved. By the time the sun filtered through the trees, the rain had dropped to a misty drizzle. Everything was soaked, but I didn't care. I got out of the tent with the hatchet in hand and circled the clearing. No footprints, just mud. But near the tree line, I found something. A small cigarette, but half buried in the wet leaves. Still fresh, still smelled faintly of tobacco. I don't smoke. No one had any reason to be up there but me. I packed everything in 15 minutes. Sloppy, rushed. I didn't care. I shoved the wet tent into its sack and jammed it into the back of the SUV. I didn't bother checking to see if I left anything. I just wanted out. That forest, which had felt peaceful the evening before, now felt like it was closing in. The drive out felt longer than the way in. Every branch that scraped the side of the truck made me jump. Every puddle made me check the mirrors. I kept thinking I'd see someone in the rear view, some figure standing in the middle of the road, but I didn't. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I drove all the way back to Fayetteville, parked in my lot, and sat in the car for a long time before going inside. I never went back to that spot. I never even looked it up again. I didn't report it. Who would I report it to? I didn't see a crime. I just saw something I wasn't meant to. Someone wandering around a remote forest during a rainy night. Maybe they were harmless. Maybe they were looking for shelter. But my gut told me something else. Told me someone had followed me, and they didn't want me to know they were there. But they did want to get close. Too close. I was 32 when my boss invited me on a weekend camping trip in Central Oregon. It was late October 2021, and the weather had started to turn. The leaves were orange and red, and the air had that heavy, earthy smell I always associated with rain. I worked at a mid-sized logistics company just outside of Eugene, and my boss, Mark Holloway, was one of those outdoorsy types, tall, lean, always wearing hiking boots even to staff meetings. I wasn't close with him, but I guess I'd said yes one too many times when he talked about hunting and backpacking. When he asked if I wanted to tag along for a 2-night camping trip out near the Cascades, I didn't want to seem soft, so I said sure. We left early on a Friday morning. Mark picked me up in his silver Tacoma just before 6. I brought a sleeping bag, a borrowed tent, a backpack, and some extra layers. He had all the real gear: big coolers, a heavy-duty camp stove, bear canisters, and a duffel stuffed with supplies that made mine look like I was packing for a backyard sleepover. Still, he seemed glad to have the company. We drove east for nearly 4 hours, winding through mountain roads and dense pine forests. We finally pulled off a gravel road about 30 miles from La Pine, down a narrow path that looked more like a deer trail than something meant for vehicles. We bounced and scraped our way deep into the trees until Mark decided we'd gone far enough. The spot was remote. No cell service, no power lines, nothing but trees in every direction. There was a small clearing with just enough flat ground for 2 tents. A creek ran nearby, barely moving but loud enough to mask smaller sounds in the forest. It was quiet in that way only deep woods can be, still and muted like the trees were listening. We set up camp. My tent leaned a little to the left, but it held. Mark's was a sleek 4-season dome with extra rain protection. He had a folding table, a camp chair, and a big cast iron skillet. He cooked us bacon and eggs over a small fire, and we drank instant coffee from mismatched mugs. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was about elk migration, weather patterns, and elevation gains. I mostly listened and nodded. That afternoon, we hiked up a ridge to get a view of the valley. It was beautiful, pines stretching forever, snow just starting to dust the mountain tops. On the way back, Mark pointed out scat and tracks, talking about what they meant. I wasn't used to walking in silence for hours, but he seemed to prefer it that way. Back at camp, the sun dropped fast behind the trees, and the cold came with it. We layered up, started another fire, and cooked hot dogs on sticks like kids. The stars came out, so bright and close it felt like you could touch them. That night, I didn't sleep much. The ground was hard, and every rustle outside made my heart thump. I heard footsteps more than once, but I told myself it was deer. The second day was colder. We woke up to frost on the tent flaps. Mark made oatmeal and strong coffee, then told me we'd do a longer hike, up along a ridge that looped around and dropped back into the clearing from the other side. It was supposed to be 8 miles, give or take. I brought water and a protein bar. Mark carried a sidearm, a map, and his GPS tracker. The first few miles were fine. The trail was overgrown but visible. We climbed steadily, the trees thinning out as we gained elevation. By mid-morning, the sun came out, and it warmed up enough that I took off my outer shell. Mark stayed ahead most of the time, walking with that quiet, confident step of someone who knew exactly where he was. I didn't. Around mile 6, we stopped to eat. Mark checked the GPS, squinted at the sky, and said we should push on quickly. Clouds were moving in. Sure enough, the weather started to shift. The sky darkened, and wind picked up from the north. By the time we started descending, it was raining. Not hard, but steady enough to soak my jacket. The trail disappeared in places, swallowed by fallen branches and underbrush. We didn't talk much. I could feel Mark getting tense. He kept checking the GPS and the compass clipped to his vest. At one point, he stopped walking and just stared at the ground, frowning. I asked if we were off trail. He didn't say anything, just looked around, then kept moving. That's when I first got uneasy. The descent took longer than I expected. The creek that was supposed to lead back to camp wasn't where it should have been, and the terrain was unfamiliar. More than once, we doubled back, walking in slow circles through wet underbrush and cold mud. The light faded, and the temperature dropped. Eventually, Mark stopped completely. He was breathing hard, staring at the GPS. Then he turned it off and shoved it in his vest. I followed him a few more minutes until he finally admitted we weren't where we were supposed to be. We made camp under a cluster of trees using a tarp and some nylon rope Mark kept in his bag. I was soaked, shivering, and scared in a way I hadn't felt since I was a kid. Mark made a fire with wet wood, somehow getting it to smoke and hiss enough to warm our hands. We ate cold beans and shared the last of the jerky. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. There were sounds, not loud ones, just the kind you notice when everything else goes quiet. Wet leaves being stepped on, sticks cracking, breathing maybe. At one point, I was sure someone was standing just outside the tarp, watching. I didn't move, just waited for the sound to go away. In the morning, we started walking again. Mark tried to hide it, but I could tell he was panicking. He moved faster, didn't explain anything, just marched through thick brush, over ridges, and across shallow creeks. My legs ached. My feet were blistered. The rain hadn't let up, and everything I wore was soaked. We hadn't seen another human being in almost 2 days. Midday, we found a broken trail marker, just a weathered wooden stake with faded red paint. Mark studied it for a long time, then decided to follow what might have been a trail. It curved east, then dropped into a valley that felt too steep. We slid more than walked, grabbing at wet branches and slippery rocks to slow our fall. At the bottom, we came across something strange. A campsite, but not ours. It looked abandoned, but recently. There was a fire ring, a tarp tied between 2 trees, and some garbage stuffed in a plastic bag. Empty cans, a burnt glove, some fishing line tangled around a branch. Felt wrong, like someone had left in a hurry. Mark didn't want to stay. He grabbed his pack and pushed forward, moving faster. I kept glancing back at the site until the trees swallowed it again. By late afternoon, we hit another creek. This one was bigger, and it curved north toward a rock formation Mark remembered seeing on a map. He looked more hopeful. We followed the water for hours, slipping on wet stones, soaked to the bone. Just before dark, we stumbled into a familiar spot, a bend in the creek that we'd crossed on the first day. From there, it was another mile to the camp. I didn't believe it until I saw Mark's truck parked between the trees. We made it back just as it got too dark to see without a flashlight. The fire pit was wet and cold. My tent had collapsed. One of the corners had been trampled by something heavy. Maybe an elk, maybe not. Mark checked his tent and froze. The zipper had been ripped open, not unzipped. Torn like someone had taken a knife to it. His duffel bag was open, supplies scattered. His sidearm was gone. We didn't sleep that night. We didn't speak either. Just sat near the fire pit, not lit, listening to the trees creak and moan. I kept thinking about the abandoned camp we passed, about the sounds in the woods, and the missing sidearm. Mark didn't move, didn't blink much, just stared into the darkness with his back against a tree. First light, we packed fast. No food, no cleanup. Just grabbed what we could and stuffed it into the truck. Mark drove faster than I'd ever seen someone drive on that narrow trail. Branches slapped the windshield. Mud sprayed the sides, and we didn't stop until we were back on the paved road. I didn't go back to work the next week. Called out sick. Mark never followed up. A few days later, I handed in my notice. I never saw him again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. We weren't just lost. Someone had been near our camp, maybe watching us the whole time. I think about that night. The ripped tent, the missing gun, the sounds in the woods, and I know we weren't alone. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found our way back that day. If we'd stayed one more night. I don't go camping anymore. Not in remote places, not with anyone I don't know well. And I never, ever talk about that trip out loud. But I remember it. Every step, every sound, every second. It was early fall when I decided to take a break from my hectic life and go camping in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. My name is Ben, and I'm 31 years old. I had been working nonstop at a tech firm in Seattle for the last few years, and the pressure had been building. I needed a break. I needed something to reset my mind. The idea of being alone, surrounded by trees and the sound of the wind, felt like the right way to recharge. I planned my trip carefully. No one knew where I was going, and I liked it that way. Just a few miles south of Mount Rainier, there was a small, mostly deserted campsite I found online, tucked deep into the woods, away from the crowded national parks. It wasn't exactly an official campground, the type of place people stumbled upon by accident or knew about because of word of mouth. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, some food, and of course my rifle just in case. I wasn't particularly worried about wildlife. Bears were rare in this part of the forest, but it was always better to be prepared. I got on the road early in the morning, eager to get to the site before sunset. The drive was smooth, a little over 2 hours on winding roads. The trees grew denser the further I went, and the air started to smell fresher, richer with the scent of pine and earth. By late afternoon, I had arrived at the site. I parked my old truck on the gravel patch and walked around for a bit, scouting out the area. The campsite itself was in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods on all sides, with a creek running nearby. It was beautiful, quiet, exactly what I needed. There were no other vehicles around, and I hadn't passed anyone for miles. I set up camp, lit a small fire, and spent the rest of the evening relaxing, listening to the sounds of the forest. By nightfall, the woods were pitch black. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I had everything I needed. No phone, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. It was peaceful, but there was something about it that made me feel a little uneasy. Something in the air that I couldn't quite place. Could have been the isolation. It had been so long since I'd spent time alone out here. I'd only been sitting by the fire for about an hour when I heard the first noise. It was faint at first, just a rustle of leaves off in the distance. At first, I brushed it off as an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of life after all. But the sound came again. This time, it was closer. My heart rate picked up a little, but I didn't let it show. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that your mind can start playing tricks on you in the dark. Still, I found myself glancing around, my eyes scanning the edges of the camp. Nothing. I went back to the fire, but the rustling continued, now a little more persistent. It wasn't the random noises of small animals anymore. It was heavier, like something was moving around deliberately, circling the campsite. My gut told me it wasn't a bear. Bears aren't that quiet. They crash through the brush, making their presence known. This was different. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows against the trees. I could almost feel the presence, like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. My hand instinctively went to the rifle by my side. I'd never used it before, but it was a comfort to have. I sat there for a while, unmoving, listening. I wanted to believe it was just a curious animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, but deep down I wasn't sure. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't shake. I stood up and grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, pointing it toward the trees on the far side of the clearing. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the underbrush, but it revealed nothing. I turned back to the campfire. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was human-shaped, tall, but bent at an odd angle. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen for a moment, the flashlight trembling in my hand. I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it, but it felt real, too real. The shadow moved again, disappearing into the trees. I quickly grabbed the rifle and backed toward the truck, my eyes darting around. There was no way it could have been a person out here. The nearest town was at least 30 miles away. The rustling continued, this time coming from the left, closer to the creek. I was no longer sitting comfortably by the fire. I was alert, every nerve in my body on edge. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. I had to make sure I wasn't being hunted, that I wasn't the prey in this situation. I started moving cautiously toward the truck, the flashlight and rifle raised, scanning the dark. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the woods to the right. A branch snapped in a way that could only mean something or someone was moving quickly through the forest. I spun around, aiming my flashlight and rifle in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what was out there, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to find out. My heart raced as I made my decision. I wasn't staying here another night. I was getting out. I grabbed my gear and started packing quickly, my hands shaking with adrenaline. As I loaded everything into the truck, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching the leaves in the distance. They were getting closer. The engine roared to life, and I slammed it into gear, speeding out of the campsite, my headlights cutting through the dark forest. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I didn't look back. I drove fast, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, expecting to see someone or something pursuing me. But there was nothing, just the empty road and the dark trees passing by in the light of my headlights. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where I felt a bit safer, surrounded by other drivers and civilization. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still out there. I couldn't explain it. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but this time felt different. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone what happened. How could I? It sounded insane. Who would believe it? A shadow in the woods, footsteps at the edge of camp, the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't enough for the cops to investigate or for anyone to take me seriously. But I knew the truth. I wasn't alone out there, and that fact made me realize something even more chilling. Whoever or whatever was out there, they were still watching.